the election battle lines drawn as Joe Biden picks his running mate, California Senator Kamala Harris. In a moment, we'll give you a special Swamp Watch investigation with shocking examples of Kamala's corruption that would be leading every news outlet if she were a Republican vice presidential nominee. But she's a Democrat, so the media are part of her campaign team, and it falls to us to bring you the truth about the Democratic ticket for November. Before we get to the politics, though, I want to say something personal about Kamala Harris. I was seated next to her at a small dinner a few years ago, and I liked her, actually. I thought she was smart and warm and human. I appreciated her efforts then to combat truancy by withholding welfare payments from delinquent parents. And I do think it's great to see someone with her background in such a prominent role. Representation does matter. But when you move from the personal to the political, it isn't clear what Kamala Harris represents. She was for banning private healthcare, then against it, then for it, then against it again. She was against legalizing drugs, then she was for it. She insinuated that Joe Biden was a racist, but now she says he's a champion of racial justice. She believed the women accusing him of sexual abuse, but now she believes his denials. I live in California and know a lot of Democrats. It literally goes with the territory. Here's the striking thing. The Democrats who know Kamala Harris cannot stand her. They all say the same in private. She lacks personal integrity and is only interested in one thing, herself. There are also consistent accounts of abusive behavior towards people who work for her. We'll have more on that later in the show. If Kamala Harris is, as the Democrats who know her say, an untrustworthy, flip-flopping, narcissistic tyrant, that's nothing new in politics. But for months, we were told that Biden would select a running mate he was simpatico with. Biden knows what being vice president is all about, so he wants someone he can really trust and work with. Well, that all turned out to be total BS. Biden and his team were told very clearly by Democrats what Kamala Harris is really like, that he couldn't trust her as far as he could throw her, that she's a total nightmare to work with. He knew all that, but he picked her anyway. Instead of simpatico, he got ultra-politico. That tells you how weak he really is. As president, he wouldn't be a leader. He'd be a follower led by the different factions in the Democratic Party. And the person he's just put on his ticket would be one of the loudest voices. We deserve to know what Vice President Harris would be saying to President Biden after everyone else has left the room. We don't need to speculate. We can see it in her record. In 2013, as California Attorney General, Harris improperly intervened in a vital ballot measure that would have saved billions from the state's budget, avoiding massive tax rises and even the blue state bailout Nancy Pelosi's demanding today. Kamala Harris scuppered reform by altering the actual language on the ballot. Why? Because she was bribed, of course. Because of political donations from public sector unions who've been the biggest roadblock to reform. $500,000 in union donations for her first statewide campaign a decade ago. Another $1 million for her re-election in 2014, double the payoff once she'd fixed the ballot measure. And it wasn't just favors for the unions. Earlier, when Kamala Harris was district attorney in San Francisco, she let a notorious con man, Ricardo Ramirez, off the hook, even though he endangered the lives of San Francisco residents with compromised construction projects. Ramirez was a crony of former San Francisco Mayor Willie Brown, who was having an affair with, you guessed it, Kamala Harris. But the story we're about to tell you is much more disgusting than any of that. Harris has repeatedly posed as a supporter of the Me Too movement and claimed to be an ally of sexual assault victims.
And let me be clear about it. The statistics are clear. You know, there's been a lot of talk about, well, why is she now coming forward? Why didn't she report? Over 60% of sexual assault victims never report the crime against them.
Interesting. Kamala Harris's predecessor at the San Francisco DA's office prosecuted a number of cases of child sexual abuse by Catholic priests. But in 2003, the U.S. Supreme Court ended that with its ruling that extending the statute of limitations in these instances was unconstitutional. So, the victims requested the DA's case files so they could take it to civil court. The files confirmed that the San Francisco Archdiocese had in its possession internal records of abuse stretching back decades, reportedly including the names of past and present members of the clergy who'd been identified in a litany of sexual abuse claims. But when Kamala Harris took over the DA's office in 2004, she blocked the release of the case files and even claimed that it was to protect the victims. But that was a lie. Those very same victims said the exact opposite.
They were pestering her office, and then what they got was this false statement that they were protecting victims. It's just a flat-out insult. She could have redacted the names, blacked out the names and left them out.
It wasn't just covering up past abuse. During her tenure as DA, Harris didn't prosecute a single new case. It's possible, of course, that none were reported, but when you look at the numbers from the Government Accountability Institute showing that all of the largest cities in the country had at least one prosecution during that time, it looks like Harris caved to her city's politically powerful Catholic establishment. Why would Kamala Harris do something like that? Let's see. During her campaign for DA, she received unprecedented amounts of cash from the Catholic establishment in San Francisco. All told, more than $60,000 in donations. In return, she covered up their sexual abuse scandal. As far as I'm concerned, there is no worse crime than the sexual abuse of children. And yet Kamala Harris sided with the abusers against the victims. That is sickening. Amy Klobuchar's vice presidential hopes were killed by something she did as district attorney, for which, frankly, she had a far better explanation than Harris does for this. It shows that in the modern Democratic Party, identity politics trumps everything, even child sexual abuse. How could Biden's vetting let this go? Kamala Harris should be thrown off the ticket in shame for what she did. But that's not the world we're in. And if, like me, you think that a Biden-Harris win would be a disaster, especially for working Americans, the only question that matters is, as Kamala Harris herself would put it, what's the best way to prosecute the case against her and her mentally malfunctioning figurehead, Joe Biden? So, here's this week's campaign memo. What I've learned over many years running political campaigns is that when you criticize your opponent, to be effective, it has to be something that a reasonable person would agree with. And it has to be something specific, with practical consequences for voters. Trying to brand Kamala Harris a far-left radical won't work. She's not principled enough to be a radical anything. Targeting her personally won't work either, calling her a phony, going on about her flip-flops on issues, even the corruption we've laid out tonight. In the end, most voters are just going to say, so what? All politicians do that. In any case, there's a simple truth about this election. If it's about personality, Trump will lose. If it's about policy, Trump will win. Here are the three things to focus on. 1. Look at the first Biden-Harris policy announcement. Compulsory mask wearing nationwide, including outdoors. What unscientific, authoritarian, bureaucratic, centralizing nonsense. Imagine the nanny state nightmare they'd inflict on our country. Armies of busybodies bossing us about from morning till night. 2. They're so keen to get into power, they've made lots of promises. The regulations would cut jobs, the spending would raise taxes. The Trump campaign needs to get specific. Saying $4 trillion in new taxes means nothing to an individual voter. Add up the promises, work out the cost for the average taxpayer. We'll bring you our own calculations soon. And 3, free healthcare, welfare and education for illegal immigrants. That would lead to a huge increase in low-wage immigration, all of it waved through by a vice president in Kamala Harris who's described ICE as the Ku Klux Klan. The headline is a simple message to an America reeling from health and economic crisis. Recovery with Trump or relapse with Biden.